They sat me next to the kitchen doors, not near the stage, not near the donors. Next to the kitchen doors, where every few minutes a waiter would shove through with a tray, and the smell of garlic butter would hit my face. I was 58 years old, wearing the one good dress I own, sitting between a security guard and two respiratory therapists, while 40 feet away, under chandeliers I couldn't afford to look at for too long, a couple I'd never met sat in my seat. Head table 1, white orchids. The good silverware. Nobody told me there'd been a mistake. Nobody apologized. I just sat there, quiet, the way I'd learned to be quiet for 31 years as a nurse, invisible in rooms full of people who mattered more than me. Then the CEO walked up to the podium. "Tonight," she said, "we'd like to finally thank a donor who has given more than $4 million to this hospital's pediatric cardiac program." Mm, I clapped along, politely, like everyone else. "Please join me in welcoming our guest of honor." She said a name. My name. 300 heads turned, away from the stage, away from head table 1, straight toward the back of the room, toward the kitchen doors, toward the folding chair I was sitting in, toward me. My napkin hit the floor. I didn't even notice. And 40 feet away, a woman in an emerald dress, the one who'd built that seating chart with her own hands, went completely, silently pale. She knew exactly what she'd done. I just didn't know why. Not yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you how I got to that ballroom, and why that seat mattered so much more than a piece of placecard cardboard. My name is Grace Calloway, and to understand what happened in that ballroom, why a hospital was thanking me, why that woman's face drained of color the second my name was said, you need to know how I got there. None of it makes sense without the rest. My husband Daniel died 6 years ago, at that same hospital, in a room on the 4th floor with a window that looked out over the parking garage. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I'd spent 3 decades on the other side of hospital rooms, the one holding the clipboard, not the one holding my husband's hand while a machine beeped. And I can tell you that nothing prepares you for how different it feels when it's your own person in the bed. During his last 2 months, Daniel and I spent a lot of time in the family lounge on the oncology floor, because it was quieter than the room, and it had a coffee machine that actually worked. Down the hall, in the pediatric cardiac unit, there was a little boy named Marcus Chen, 8 years old, waiting for a valve repair that his family's insurance had fought for months to approve. His mother, Linda, used to bring him to that same lounge in his wheelchair because he liked the window. Daniel and Marcus became something like friends, in the strange, compressed way people do in hospitals. 2 people from completely different chapters of life. Both scared, both waiting. Marcus made it. His surgery went well. Daniel did not. 2 weeks before he died, lying in that 4th floor room, my husband told me he wanted to do something with the money from selling his business, a small manufacturing company he'd built from nothing over 30 years. Not a plaque, not a scholarship with his name carved into stone somewhere. He wanted to fund pediatric cardiac care, quietly, so that no family would ever again have to fight an insurance company while their child's heart was failing. Quietly, he said, and he meant it in a very specific way. Daniel had been burned once before, decades earlier, by a business partner who'd used Daniel's name and his money to build something for himself while Daniel wasn't looking. He never fully trusted institutions after that. So when he had our attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named James O.C., draw up the trust that would become the Calloway Cardiac Fund, Daniel insisted on one non-negotiable clause. The donor, meaning eventually me, would retain the contractual right to a full, independent audit of how the restricted funds were used, on demand, with results required to be presented publicly at the Foundation's next major event. "You'll probably never need it," James told me, the week after Daniel's funeral, sliding the papers across his desk for my signature. "But your husband wanted it in there anyway," he said, and I'm quoting him, "People forget who's watching until you remind them." I signed it and didn't think about that clause again for 6 years. That's the thing about safety nets. You don't think about them until the day you fall. I kept working. Nursing wasn't just a job for me. It was the only version of myself I really recognized in the mirror. I picked up per-dime shifts in the ICU and, later, in the pediatric cardiac unit, partly because the hospital was short-staffed and partly, if I'm honest, because being near that unit felt like being near Daniel. Only 3 people at Riverside Memorial ever knew that Grace Calloway, RN, and the anonymous C. Calloway Trust that funded half their pediatric equipment budget were the same person. Diane Marsh, the CEO, the head of the pediatric cardiac unit, a surgeon named Dr. Sarah Whitfield, and James Osei, who handled every disbursement personally so that no one in the development office ever had to know my face. Which brings me to the woman in the emerald dress. Vanessa Kirkland had been Riverside Memorial Foundation's Director of Development and Events for almost 5 years by the time of that gala. She was, by every outward measure, excellent at her job. Donor pledges had nearly tripled under her leadership, and the annual gala had grown from a modest dinner into the social event of Hartwell's winter calendar. She was 44, sharp, magnetic in the way people are when they've decided charm is a tool and not just a personality trait. I'd crossed paths with her exactly twice before that night, both times in hospital hallways, both times so briefly she wouldn't have recognized my face if I'd walked past her in a grocery store. What I didn't know then, what almost none of us knew, was that Vanessa had spent 3 years quietly steering a portion of the foundation's money into a company called Kirkland Premier Events and Consulting LLC, registered to her younger brother Tyler. Inflated vendor invoices, padded production costs, money that was supposed to become cardiac monitors and surgical equipment, instead becoming her brother's condo payments, and eventually hers. I also didn't know that on the night before the gala, Vanessa had personally rewritten the seating chart. I would learn all of that in pieces over the following months. But that night, all I knew was this. I had been placed at the back of the room, next to the kitchen doors, wearing the one good dress I own, while a room full of strangers who'd never met me applauded a version of me they didn't recognize yet. The days right after the gala were strange. People I'd worked beside for years suddenly looked at me differently in the hallways. Not unkindly, just carefully. The way you look at someone once you realize you didn't fully know who they were. Dr. Whitfield hugged me in the break room and said, "I always wondered. I'm glad it was you." Marcus Chen, 15 now, taller than his mother, sent me a message through Linda that just said, "Thank you for my heart." And I had to sit down in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes before I could drive home. But underneath the warmth, something small and stubborn kept scratching at me. I hadn't asked to be embarrassed in front of 300 people. I hadn't asked to be seated with the kitchen doors banging against my chair for 45 minutes before anyone realized where I actually belonged. And more than the embarrassment, which honestly I could have let go, there was a quieter, older feeling underneath it. 31 years of being the person who empties the bedpan and adjusts the drip, while someone else gets thanked in the hallway for the recovery. 31 years of standing at the edges of rooms like that one. I told myself I was being petty. I told myself it didn't matter now, since everyone knew the truth by the end of the night anyway. I might have let it go completely, if not for Priya. Priya Nandwani was 26, a junior development associate in Vanessa's office, and I knew her from a very different context. 3 years earlier, her mother had spent 11 days in my ICU after a stroke, and Priya had practically lived in that unit's family lounge, bringing me coffee at 2 in the morning as a way of thanking me for things I don't even remember doing. We'd stayed in touch, loosely, the way people do after something like that. She found me in the hospital cafeteria 4 days after the gala, sliding into the seat across from me with the particular stiffness of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know I tried to say something before." "Before what?" "Before you got put at that table." She was turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, not looking at me. "Vanessa changed the seating chart the night before the gala. I built the original one myself, 3 weeks out, from the master list Diane's office sent over. You were at head table 1. It said so right on the chart. C. Calloway, guest of honor, do not move." I saw it with my own eyes. So what happened? Around 9 the night before, Vanessa called me into her office. She said we needed to make room at head table 1 for a couple named Ashford, Bill and Carol Ashford. Big real estate money. She'd been courting them for months for something outside of the hospital, some private consulting thing she wanted to start. She told me to move whoever was least likely to complain. I asked about the note, "Do not move," and she said, and I'm quoting her exactly, "It's probably just a clerical thing. Some nurse who won some raffle seat. It won't matter. I sat with that for a moment. She didn't check. She didn't check, Priya said. I told her the note looked deliberate. She told me it wasn't my job to worry about it. So I moved you to the staff table, because that's what she told me to do, and I've felt sick about it ever since. I want to be honest about how I felt hearing that. Part of me wanted to be gracious about it, to say, well, mistakes happen. Everyone's under pressure the night before a big event. No harm done in the end. That was my first instinct, and for about a week, it was the story I told myself. I even said as much when Vanessa called me herself, 3 days after Priya's confession, her voice warm and quick with apology. Grace, can I call you Grace? I am mortified, genuinely mortified. There was a scheduling mix-up on our end, purely administrative, and I take full responsibility. I'd love to take you to lunch, properly apologize, make sure you know how valued you are to this institution. We had that lunch. She was charming, self-deprecating, quick to laugh at her own supposed carelessness. She talked about the pressure of running a 400-person event with a skeleton staff, and I found myself nodding along, feeling almost guilty for having been bothered at all. When I got home that evening, I actually called Priya and gently told her maybe she'd read more into the seating chart than was really there. Mix-ups happen. People get overwhelmed. Priya didn't argue with me, but she also didn't sound convinced, and neither, if I'm honest, was I. Not entirely. The thing that changed everything wasn't the seating chart. It was a cardiac monitor. I was covering a shift in the pediatric cardiac unit in early December when Dr. Whitfield mentioned, almost in passing, that she was still waiting on the new telemetry monitoring system for the step-down unit, the one that had been approved and, according to the fund's year-end report I'd received from James Osei, fully purchased and installed back in September. Installed where? I asked her. Because I did rounds on step-down Tuesday, and it's the same equipment we had 2 years ago. Dr. Whitfield frowned. We requested that system in the spring. I signed off on the budget line myself. As far as I know, it never arrived. I've been telling Vanessa's office it's a priority for months. That was the first thread, a small one. Easy to explain away, maybe a vendor delay, maybe a paperwork lag, maybe the wrong report had been sent to me. I wanted it to be something like that. I called James Osei and asked him to pull the itemized disbursement records for the cardiac equipment line for that year. What came back looked, on its face, completely normal. A line item. Cardiac telemetry system upgrade, $214,000, paid to Meridian Health Systems, September 12th. Everything matched, on paper. I might have let it rest there, except I mentioned the discrepancy to Priya, almost casually, the next time I saw her, and her face did something I hadn't expected. She went quiet in a way that felt different from guilt. It felt like recognition. Meridian Health Systems, she repeated. That name's been coming up less lately. A lot of our vendor invoices this year route through a company called Kirkland Premier Events and Consulting. I noticed it because it's an odd name for a company that's supposedly supplying medical equipment. I figured it was a subcontractor thing. Kirkland, I said. Like Vanessa, Priya said. I didn't think anything of it at first. It's not that uncommon a name, but I looked it up out of curiosity a while back. The LLC's registered agent is a Tyler Kirkland. Same address as a condo building, 3 blocks from Vanessa's building. She hesitated. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure it meant anything. Companies share names with employees' relatives all the time. It could be nothing. It could have been nothing. That's the maddening part of the truth. When you're standing at the edge of it, it always looks like it could still be nothing. I want to pause here and admit something. Everything about my instincts told me to walk away at this point. I had a lunch already behind me where Vanessa had charmed me into doubting my own judgment once. I had 31 years of being the person in the room who keeps her head down and does her job. Confronting a hospital's director of development over invoice line items felt, frankly, absurd, like something outside the boundaries of who I was. But I kept thinking about Daniel and the audit clause he'd insisted on, the one I'd signed without a second thought. People forget who's watching until you remind them. I hadn't been watching. Not really. For 6 years, I'd let the anonymity of my giving become a kind of comfortable distance, out of sight, and therefore apparently out of mind, for the people responsible for spending it. So I called James Osei and asked him, formally, to request 3 years of itemized vendor records for every disbursement drawn from the restricted cardiac fund. Not an audit yet, just records. A donor's reasonable request. The records took 11 days to arrive, which James said was unusually slow for a routine pull. When they finally came, Priya, off the clock, on her own laptop, after I told her exactly what I was looking at and asked if she'd be willing to help me understand it, spent a weekend cross-referencing invoice numbers against actual delivery and installation dates from the hospital's own facilities logs. What she found was this. Over the previous 3 years, Kirkland Premier Events and Consulting had billed the Callaway Fund and the General Foundation account combined just over $1.1 million for event production, vendor coordination, and equipment procurement services. Several of the equipment line items billed through that company either never appeared in the hospital's facilities or biomedical engineering logs at all, or appeared months later than invoiced, at a fraction of the billed cost, purchased through an entirely different, legitimate vendor. The gap, as close as Priya could calculate it, was somewhere around $340,000. Money that had left my husband's fund, money that had never become the equipment it was supposed to become. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with those spreadsheets spread out in front of me, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not even anger yet, but a kind of cold, quiet grief. Daniel had wanted this money to save children's hearts. Somebody had been quietly bleeding it instead. James Osei was cautious, in the way good lawyers are. This is enough to justify formal action, he told me, in his office, the folder of Priya's findings between us. It is not yet enough to prove intent, or to prove Vanessa Kirkland personally directed or profited from it, rather than her brother acting alone with her, simply being a careless approver. We need the money trail, not just the paper trail, bank records. Something that puts her fingerprints directly on the theft, not just her name on an org chart near it. So what do? We request a meeting with Richard Voss, James said. Voss was the foundation's board chair, a retired hospital administrator, respected, cautious, exactly the kind of person who would want ironclad proof before believing his own director of development had been running a 3-year skim. Quietly, present what we have. Let the board's own audit process take it from there, with more resources and legal authority than we have. It felt, for the first time in weeks, like solid ground. We scheduled the meeting with Voss for the second week of January. I remember feeling almost light that week, the particular, dangerous lightness of thinking the hard part is behind you. It wasn't. 4 days before our meeting with Voss, Priya called me at 11 at night, her voice tight and fast in a way I'd never heard from her. I got locked out of my system this afternoon, she said. It said it was a routine security review. My account got flagged for after-hours file access, which, it's true, I did access old vendor files after hours, but I did it on my own laptop from home, not through the hospital network. I was careful. Slow down, I said. What happened? Vanessa called me into her office an hour ago. She knew Grace. She knew I'd been pulling old Kirkland Premier invoices. She didn't say how. She just sat there and told me that donor relations is a sensitive area, and that she'd noticed I'd developed an unusual personal relationship with a major donor, and that she was recommending I be placed on administrative leave while HR reviewed concerns about confidentiality and boundary violations. My stomach dropped. She's putting this on you. She's putting this on both of us, Priya said. She told Voss's assistant she wants an emergency board session. I think she's going to get to him before we do. She was right. Vanessa Kirkland was many things, but slow was never one of them. The emergency session happened 2 days later, and neither Priya nor I were in the room for it, which, I understand now, was exactly the point. James Osei was allowed to attend on my behalf, and he came out of that meeting looking older than he had going in. Here is what Vanessa told the board, according to James, that a junior employee, Priya Nandwani, had been improperly accessing confidential vendor files outside of her job duties, apparently at the personal request of a major donor, Grace Callaway, whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and controlling since the embarrassing seating mix-up at November's Gala, a mix-up Vanessa now framed, with what James called impressive theatrical regret, as the root of the whole problem. She suggested, without quite saying it outright, that I had been humiliated that night and had since developed an inappropriate fixation on scrutinizing the Foundation's operations as a form of retaliation, and that Priya, out of misplaced loyalty from our old hospital connection, had let herself be used. It was, I have to admit, brilliant. It took the one true thing everyone in that room already knew, that I'd been publicly embarrassed in November, and used it to explain away the one thing that could expose her. The board, cautious and conflict-averse by nature, voted to keep Priya on unpaid leave pending a formal HR review, and to pause further correspondence with me regarding fund disbursement records until the matter could be properly reviewed by counsel, which, practically speaking, meant indefinitely. I found out about all of it on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in my car outside the hospital, because James didn't want to tell me over the phone. I remember staring through the windshield at the same parking garage Daniel used to look at from his hospital window, and feeling, for the first time since he died, truly alone in something. Priya called me that night, crying in a way she tried very hard to hide. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. I've probably lost my job over this, and we still can't even prove anything." "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her, and I meant it, even though I wasn't sure yet how we were going to fix it. That was, without question, the lowest point. Priya suspended and terrified. Vanessa not only untouched, but somehow strengthened, having converted my own humiliation into a weapon against me. Dr. Whitfield, understandably protective of her department's funding, quietly told me she couldn't afford to be seen taking sides in what was being described internally as a donor dispute. Even Diane Marsh, the CEO, who denounced me as guest of honor with such warmth 2 months earlier, sent me a carefully worded email about wanting to ensure all parties feel heard, that told me nothing except that she, too, was staying out of it for now. I sat with that folder of spreadsheets in my kitchen for 3 days without opening it again. I thought seriously about letting the whole thing go, writing it off, quietly moving the fund's future disbursements to be even more tightly controlled by James, and simply walking away from Riverside Memorial's Gala circuit entirely. I was 58 years old. I didn't need this fight. But I kept coming back to one thing. Not anger, exactly. Something steadier than that. Daniel used to say that the people who get away with things count on everyone else being too tired, or too polite, or too afraid of looking petty to keep watching. He built an entire clause into a legal document because he refused to be the kind of person who stopped watching. I had spent 2 months letting other people's discomfort, the board's, Dr. Whitfield's, even my own, talk me into looking away. I called James Osei on a Sunday morning and told him I wanted to stop asking politely. "You don't need the board's permission," James reminded me, laying Daniel's original trust document on my kitchen table for what felt like the 100th time in 6 years. "You have a contractual audit right. It doesn't require Richard Voss's approval, or Vanessa Kirkland's cooperation, or even the CEO's blessing. It requires 30 days written notice, and it requires the results to be presented at the Foundation's next major public event, in full, to the donor and the board simultaneously." That was Daniel's language, word for word. "And if they refuse?" "They can't," James said. "Refusing would itself be a material breach that gives you grounds to redirect all future funding elsewhere, a fact the board's own counsel would recognize instantly if push came to shove. Nobody wants that fight. Nobody wants the story of a hospital foundation refusing an audit from a $4 million children's cardiac donor." We drafted the formal notice that week. I hired, on James's recommendation, an independent forensic accountant named Ruth Aldridge, who had done similar work untangling nonprofit finances for 2 decades, and had, refreshingly, no ties to Hartwell's social circles at all. Priya, still on unpaid leave, but no longer employed by the Foundation in any capacity that could be used against her, was free, for the first time, to hand over everything she'd found directly to Ruth, on the record, as a private citizen assisting an independent audit rather than an employee accessing confidential files. The 30-day notice period landed the audit results squarely on the calendar for Riverside Memorial's next major public event, which, as it happened, had recently been moved up. Vanessa had pushed hard back in December to accelerate the ribbon cutting for the hospital's new pediatric wing from the following spring to late February, citing year-end donor momentum and a desire to capitalize on the gala's fundraising energy. At the time, everyone had assumed it was simple ambition. Diane Marsh, when James quietly informed her what the audit would show, put a different word to it. She wanted it moved up, Diane said slowly. In a private meeting James arranged once he'd shown her Ruth Aldridge's preliminary findings. Because she was planning to leave. She's been telling people for months she's launching her own consulting firm this spring. Diane's face, James told me later, went pale in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She wanted one more big event to bill through her brother's company before she disappeared. Diane Marsh, to her credit, did not try to protect the institution's reputation by burying the report. She agreed, once she'd reviewed Ruth's findings herself, that the audit results would be presented exactly as Daniel's contract required, publicly, at the ribbon cutting, in front of the board, the press, and Riverside Memorial's assembled donors. Vanessa, of course, was the one organizing that ribbon cutting. She had no idea what was coming. The ribbon cutting for the Daniel and Grace Calloway, though it wasn't called that yet, Pediatric Cardiac Center, took place on a bright, cold Saturday in late February, in a tent erected on the hospital's front lawn, string lights overhead, a podium draped in blue and white ribbon facing rows of folding chairs. Marcus Chen and his mother sat in the second row. Dr. Whitfield sat near the front, in her white coat, having been asked by Diane to say a few words about what the new equipment would mean for her patients. Equipment that, thanks to Ruth Aldridge's findings and my own emergency top-up to the fund, had finally fully arrived that week. Vanessa Kirkland ran the event exactly as she'd run every event for 5 years, flawlessly, warmly, moving between donors with a glass of sparkling cider and a smile that never wavered. She had survived a scare in January. She believed, as far as I could tell, that she had won. I sat in the front row, between James Osei and Priya, who had come back for this, not as an employee, but as my guest, the same way she'd once brought me coffee at 2 a.m. in a family lounge neither of us has ever really left behind. Diane Marsh opened the program, thanked everyone for coming, and then said something that made Vanessa's smile flicker for the first time all afternoon. Before we cut the ribbon today, there's a matter of accountability the hospital owes to its donors and to this community. As many of you know, this pediatric center exists because of the extraordinary generosity of the Calloway Cardiac Fund. Under the terms of that fund's original trust agreement, the donor is entitled to a full public accounting of how restricted funds have been used. That audit has been completed. I'd like to invite forensic accountant Ruth Aldridge to share the findings. I watched Vanessa's face while Ruth walked to the podium with a slim folder under her arm. I watched the exact moment recognition arrived. Not panic yet, just a fast, sharp calculation, the look of someone already drafting the story she'd tell. Ruth did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out, in plain, unhurried language, 3 years of invoices from Kirkland Premier Events and Consulting LLC, registered to Tyler Kirkland, a company that had billed the foundation over $1.1 million for services and equipment that either never arrived late and incomplete, or had been separately, legitimately purchased through other vendors at a fraction of the invoiced cost. She showed the bank records James Osei had obtained through the audit's legal authority, records showing regular transfers from Tyler Kirkland's business account into Vanessa Kirkland's personal accounts, totaling, over 3 years, just over $390,000. This is a fundraising strategy question, not a... Vanessa started, moving toward the podium, her voice pitched for the crowd, warm and reasonable, the same voice she'd used on me over lunch 2 months earlier. I think there's context missing here about how event production budgets typically... Vanessa. Richard Voss stood up from the front row, and I will remember the sound of his voice for a long time, not loud, just final. The transfers are to your personal account, not your brother's business account for further business expenses, yours. For one moment, a long one, Vanessa Kirkland stood at the edge of the podium and said nothing at all. And then, because she was the kind of person who had never once in 3 years imagined the ground could actually give way beneath her, she made the mistake that ended it. I raised that money, she said, and her voice cracked in a way I don't think she intended. Every dollar in that fund exists because I built this gala from nothing. I earned... She stopped herself half a second too late. The word hung in the cold February air over a lawn full of people who had come to celebrate a wing built for children with failing hearts. Nobody clapped. Nobody said anything at all, for a moment, except the wind moving through the tent. What happened next unfolded quickly, the way these things do once the truth finally has somewhere to stand. Vanessa was placed on immediate leave that afternoon and terminated within the week. The hospital's board referred the matter, along with Ruth Aldridge's full report, to the district attorney's office. Both Vanessa and Tyler Kirkland were eventually charged with fraud and theft from a nonprofit organization. I'm told that case is still working its way through the courts, and I don't know yet how it will end, and honestly, by that point, I found I didn't need to watch it to the last page to feel like something had already been settled. Richard Voss called me personally, 2 weeks after the ribbon cutting, to apologize, not just for what Vanessa had done, but for how quickly the board had believed her account of me and Priya back in January. We should have asked harder questions in that first meeting, he said. We didn't, because it was easier not to. I appreciated that he didn't dress it up as anything more than what it was. Priya was reinstated the following month, not to her old junior position, but as the foundation's new interim director of development, a job, she told me, half laughing, half terrified, she had never once imagined for herself. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's a mistake, she admitted to me over coffee, the same way she used to bring me coffee in that family lounge years ago, only now she was the one asking questions, and I was the one answering. It's not a mistake, I told her. You were the only person in that building who told me the truth when it would have been easier not to. Dr. Whitfield got her monitors, properly purchased, properly installed, tested and running within a month. The wing was formally renamed, at Diane Marsh's insistence and over my mild objection, the Daniel and Grace Calloway Pediatric Cardiac Center, with a small brass plaque near the entrance that Marcus Chen, now 16, asked if he could be the one to unveil. The following November, when the invitation to Riverside Memorial's annual gala arrived in my mailbox, gold script, same as always, as our honored guest, your presence is requested, Diane Marsh called me herself a few days later to confirm my seat at head table 1. I told her I'd like to sit with the nursing staff instead. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her deciding whether I was joking. Grace, you're the guest of honor. People are going to expect. I know, I said. I'd still like to sit with the nurses. I spent 31 years at that table, Diane. I'm not embarrassed by it. I never was. What I didn't say, because I didn't need to, was that a year earlier, being placed at that table had felt like erasure, like someone deciding, without asking me, that a nurse's seat and a donor's seat couldn't possibly be the same chair. This year, sitting there would be a choice, made by me, and there is a whole world of difference between being put somewhere and choosing to stand your ground there. Diane, to her credit, laughed and said she'd have Priya set it up personally. At that gala, 12 months almost to the day after a room full of strangers turned to stare at a woman by the kitchen doors, I sat at a round table near the back, between 2 respiratory therapists and Frank the security guard, who told me he'd been saving me a seat all year just in case. Marcus Chen and his mother came and pulled up 2 extra chairs without asking anyone's permission. Priya sat down across from me in a dress I remembered her borrowing from her mother, and lifted her water glass toward mine in something like a toast. When Diane Marsh took the podium later that evening, and, without any fanfare this time, simply said, I'd like to once again thank our guest of honor, who you'll find tonight exactly where she wants to be. The whole room turned to look at our table again. This time, nobody was surprised. And this time, when I stood up, I didn't drop my napkin. I think about Daniel a lot when I think about that year. About a man who spent his last 2 weeks worrying not about being remembered, but about making sure the good he did couldn't quietly be stolen out from under him after he was gone. I think about how right he was to insist on that clause nobody thought we'd ever need, but mostly I think about the seat. Not because of where it was in the room, but because of what it took me to understand that I got to decide what it meant. Nobody gets to hand you your worth on a place card, and nobody gets to take it away on one either. It took me 31 years, 1 devastating loss, and 1 long, quiet fight to understand that. I imagine some of you watching this already know it. For those of you who don't yet, I hope you get there faster than I did.